Maren had learned long ago that the nobility did not see her. They saw her hands when they needed a poultice for a wound. They saw her voice when they needed to be told a fever would break by morning. They never saw her face long enough to remember it, and she had made peace with that invisibility, the way one makes peace with rain in autumn, not because it was pleasant, but because fighting it changed nothing. On the morning of the harvest fair, she rose before dawn to grind chamomile and dry lavender for the stalls, humming an old tune her mother used to sing, and she did not know that by nightfall, every person in the village of Aldermore would know her name whether they wished to or not. The fair filled the square with color and noise, ribbons strung between the eaves of the bakery and the smithy, children chasing each other between barrels of apples, and above it all rose the low murmur of anticipation that came only once a year. When the royal procession arrived for the blessing of the sacred creatures, it was tradition older than anyone living could remember, a ceremony in which the white unicorn of Aldermore, guardian beast of the royal line, walked among the gathered crowd and bowed before whichever noble the court had decided merited its favor that season. It was theater more than mysticism these days, or so the older women whispered while kneading bread, a performance meant to remind the people that the crown still held the old magic even as the old magic grew thin and distant with each passing decade. Maren had seen the ceremony 11 times in her life and had never once stood close enough to see the unicorn's eyes. She intended this year to be no different, tucked behind her herb stall at the edge of the square, selling tinctures to servants sent ahead of their masters. She did not notice when the murmur of the crowd shifted into something sharper, a held breath rippling backward through the square like wind through wheat, until the crowd around her stall began to part, and she looked up to see people stepping back, clearing a path, their faces caught somewhere between awe and confusion. The white unicorn walked toward her. It moved the way water moves, without apparent effort, its coat so pale it seemed to hold its own light even beneath the gray autumn sky. And its eyes, when it stopped before her stall, were not animal eyes at all. They were ancient and searching, and they looked at Maren the way no noble had ever looked at her, as though she were the only person present worth seeing. She stood frozen, a jar of dried mint still in her hand, as the creature lowered its great head and folded its legs beneath it, kneeling in the dirt of the square before a woman who sold herbs for a living and owned nothing finer than the wool dress on her back. The square fell utterly silent. Somewhere behind her, a jar shattered as someone's hand went slack with shock. Maren could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the eyes of the entire village and the entire royal court settling on her like a physical weight, and she understood in that moment that whatever her life had been an hour before, it would never be that simple again, she whispered, because it seemed cruel to leave the animal kneeling in the mud, and it did rise slow and deliberate, before pressing its muzzle once against her shoulder and stepping back to stand beside her as though it belonged there, as though it had always belonged there. And the crowd began to murmur again, louder this time, 100 voices asking the same question in different words. Why her? Why the herb girl? Why now? King Rydian Ashcroft had not spoken since the unicorn broke from its ceremonial line, and when he finally did, his voice carried across the square with the particular stillness of a man who has just watched something he believed impossible happen in front of him. The creature has not bowed to anyone in 11 years, he said, more to himself than to the court around him, and Maren, who had never been within 20 paces of the king in her life, found herself the sole object of his attention, his dark eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her want to disappear back behind her stall. He was younger than the stories made him sound, though the weight he carried was old, the kind of weight that came from ruling a kingdom whose ancient pacts were fraying at the edges and whose court trusted him only as far as his throne could protect their interests. He crossed the square himself, ignoring the flustered attendants who moved to intercept him, and stopped an arm's length from Maren, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he has been solving his whole life and has just found a missing piece for. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question, so simple, felt enormous in the silence that followed it. "Maren," she said. "Maren of the Healer's Row." The unicorn has bowed only 3 times in the history of this kingdom, he said, quiet enough that only she and the nearest attendants could hear. Each time to someone whose blood the crown had forgotten. I would very much like to understand why it has chosen to remember yours. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more emotional stories like this one waiting for you. And it truly helps the channel grow when you show your support. Lady Isadora Vane watched the entire spectacle from beneath the royal canopy, with an expression carved carefully into pleasant neutrality, though anyone who knew her well would have seen the tightening at the corner of her mouth, the way her fingers curled slightly tighter around her fan. She was the king's cousin, raised alongside him since childhood, groomed by half the court to become his queen in all but formal title, and she had spent the last 3 years cultivating that position with the patience of a woman who understood that power given too quickly could always be taken away just as quickly. She did not intend to lose ground to a woman who smelled of dried herbs and had likely never worn silk in her life. How curious, Isadora said to the noblewoman beside her, her tone light and unbothered, though the words themselves carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood if one listened closely. The beast has always had strange taste. Last season it startled a duke's hunting hound half to death. I imagine it simply smelled her tinctures and mistook her for prey. The women around her laughed, and Isadora smiled the smile she had practiced since she was a girl, the one that made cruelty sound like wit. But her eyes did not leave Marin, and something cold and calculating settled behind them, the look of a woman recalculating a plan she had believed was already secured. By the time the royal procession returned to the castle that evening, word had already spread through every household in Aldermore, and by the time it spread to the neighboring villages, it had grown into a dozen different rumors, each stranger than the last. Marin herself was given no choice in the matter, escorted by 2 of the king's own guards to the castle, before she had even finished closing her stall. Her protests met with polite but immovable insistence, and she found herself standing in a hall larger than her entire home, waiting to be summoned before a king who apparently believed her blood held some secret even she did not know. The royal historian, an elderly man named Thorn, who had spent 40 years buried in the castle archives, was the one who finally uncovered the truth 3 days after the fair, his hands trembling with the particular excitement of a scholar who has just found the answer to a question everyone stopped asking generations ago. He requested an audience with the king immediately, a thick and dust-covered ledger clutched against his chest, and when Rydian summoned Marin to hear what the old man had found, she arrived expecting some minor explanation. A distant cousin of a minor lord, perhaps. Nothing that would change the shape of her life. The Covenant of Aldermore was signed 400 years ago, Thorn began, unrolling a parchment so old its edges crumbled at the touch. Between the first king of this land and the guardian spirits of the sacred creatures, the unicorns among them. The covenant promised that the bloodline of the founding queen, Queen Elenya, would always be recognized and protected by the creatures of the old magic. Even if that bloodline scattered, even if it was forgotten by history itself, even if it survived only in the hands of a healer's daughter, who never knew her own name carried weight. He looked up at Marin over the rim of his spectacles, his expression somewhere between wonder and disbelief. Your mother's family name was recorded in a parish register 3 villages from here, a name that traces directly back to a lady-in-waiting who fled the capital during the civil unrest 2 centuries past, carrying with her, according to this record, a child of Queen Elenya's own line. The hall was silent except for the crackle of the hearth fire. Marin felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she had not moved at all. That cannot be true, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction to make the words sound like fact rather than plea. I am no one. I grind herbs. I have never owned a single fine thing in my life. The unicorn did not bow to fine things, Rydian said quietly. And when she looked at him, she found none of the mockery she expected, only something gentler and more unsettling, a kind of recognition that made her chest ache in a way she did not have a name for yet. It bowed to blood the old magic never forgot, even when the rest of us did. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below, because I would truly love to hear what you think Marin will decide to do with a truth this heavy. The weeks that followed were harder than Marin had expected, in ways that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the strange, quiet unraveling of everything she believed about herself. She was given rooms in the castle she did not ask for and did not want, attended by servants who did not know whether to treat her as royalty or imposter, and so treated her, awkwardly, as both. She learned that being seen, after a lifetime of being invisible, was its own kind of exhausting weight, every glance from the court weighing her worth, every whispered conversation in the corridors speculating on whether she was a miracle or a very convenient lie. Rydian sought her out more often than propriety strictly allowed, first with the excuse of discussing the covenant, then with excuses that grew thinner and more transparent with each visit, until eventually he stopped pretending he needed an excuse at all. He found her in the castle gardens one evening, kneeling in the dirt among the healer's herbs the head gardener had grudgingly allowed her to plant, her sleeves rolled up and her hands stained green, looking more at ease than he had seen her look since the day the unicorn knelt before her. "You do not have to keep proving you belong here," he said, watching her work. "I am not proving anything," she said, not looking up. "I am simply doing the only thing I know how to do well. Everything else in this castle makes me feel like a costume someone else is wearing." He crouched beside her, an act so far beneath his station that a passing servant nearly dropped her basket of linens at the sight of it, and picked up a handful of the loose soil, turning it over in his fingers the way a man handles something he does not quite understand but wants to. "When I was a boy," he said, "my father told me the old magic chooses people who forget to want power, because power that is wanted too badly always corrupts what it touches." I did not understand what he meant until I watched the unicorn kneel in the mud in front of a woman selling dried mint who looked as though she wished the ground would simply swallow her whole, rather than draw attention. He looked at her, and there was no calculation in his gaze at all, only the plain honesty of a man who had spent his whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, and had finally found someone who wanted nothing. "I find that I want to know you, Marin, not the covenant. Not the bloodline, you!" She did not answer him for a long moment, her chest too full of something she had no experience naming, because no one in her life had ever wanted simply to know her, and the wanting felt more dangerous than any court intrigue could ever be. "I am afraid," she finally admitted, "that the moment I let myself want this back, it will be taken from me, the way everything comfortable in my life has eventually been taken. I have learned not to reach for things I cannot keep." "Then let me reach first," he said, "and you can decide later whether you trust the hand that is holding on." Isadora did not wait idly, while the king's affections drifted somewhere she had not planned for. She was, above all things, patient and precise, and she understood that a frontal attack against a woman blessed by the sacred unicorn would only make Marin more sympathetic in the eyes of the court and the people. Instead, she worked in smaller, quieter ways, ensuring that certain nobles who might otherwise have supported Marin's claim heard rumors questioning the historian's research, ensuring that certain merchants who supplied the castle heard that the healer girl's tinctures had once poisoned a customer, a lie so specific it took 3 days to trace back to its source, and by then had already done its damage. She smiled through every court dinner, complimented Marin's composure to her face, and undid the compliment behind closed doors with a dozen carefully placed words to a dozen carefully chosen ears. It was Rydian himself who finally noticed the pattern, sitting with his advisors late one night, reviewing the sudden and coordinated wave of doubt spreading through the merchant guilds. And when he traced the threads back to their origin, his expression hardened into something Marin had not yet seen on his face, a cold and controlled fury that made even his most senior advisors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I did not raise you to be cruel, Isadora," he said when he confronted her privately, his voice low enough that the guards outside the door could not hear the words, only the tension beneath them. "I did not raise myself to be discarded either," Isadora answered. And for the first time, the careful mask slipped enough to show something raw underneath it, something closer to grief than malice. I spent 3 years preparing to stand beside you, Rydian. I learned every treaty, every trade route, every noble house's grievance and ambition because I believed that was the price of being useful enough to matter to you. And in one afternoon, a woman who sells herbs undid 3 years of careful work simply by existing. She looked away from him, her jaw tight. I am not sorry for protecting what I built. I am only sorry it was never enough to be chosen on its own merit. Rydian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge, replaced by something more tired and more honest. You were never discarded because Marin appeared. You were never truly chosen in the first place, not by me. And I let you believe otherwise for longer than I should have, because it was easier than admitting the truth to either of us. That failure is mine, not hers, and it is not one I intend to correct by punishing her for it. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on, because the final chapters of this journey are coming, and you will not want to miss a single moment of it. The reckoning, when it finally came, arrived in the form of a formal challenge that Isadora herself requested before the full court. A ritual older even than the Covenant, one that allowed any noble to formally contest a claim of royal blood before the sacred creatures themselves rendered final judgment. It was a desperate gamble, Rydian knew. One final attempt by his cousin to reclaim ground through the one arena where politics and whispered rumor held no power at all. And he could not refuse her the right to ask it without appearing to fear the outcome. The ceremony was held at dawn, beneath the ancient oak where the original covenant had been signed 4 centuries before. The entire court gathered in a wide circle, breath visible in the cold morning air, and at the center stood Marin, dressed not in borrowed finery, but in the simple healer's dress she had worn the day the unicorn first knelt before her, because she had decided, in the quiet hours before dawn, that if she was to be judged, she would be judged as herself and no one else. The white unicorn was led into the circle, and beside it walked 3 other sacred creatures rarely seen outside the deepest royal ceremonies. A falcon that had not left the mountain aviary in a decade, a great elk whose antlers were said to hold pieces of the old magic itself, and an owl so pale it seemed carved from moonlight. Thorn, trembling with age and the weight of the moment, read the ancient words of the covenant aloud, his voice carrying strangely far in the silent morning, and when he finished, he stepped back, and the creatures were released to render their judgment. Isadora stood rigid, her chin lifted, refusing to let her fear show even now, and when the falcon circled once above her head and did not descend, a small sound escaped her, quickly swallowed. The elk passed close to several nobles in the crowd, sniffing curiously, and moved on without pause. The owl settled briefly on the shoulder of an elderly duchess known for her fairness, and then lifted away again, its judgment, whatever it meant, unspoken. Then the white unicorn walked directly to Marin, exactly as it had in the village square weeks before, and knelt, but this time it did something it had not done at the fair. It lowered its head further, touching its horn briefly to the earth before her feet, a gesture so ancient that Thorn actually gasped audibly, his hands flying to his mouth. "That is the mark of full recognition," he said, his voice shaking. "Not merely acknowledgement of blood. That is the covenant naming her before all of you, as the last living heir of Queen Elenia's line." The silence that followed broke apart into a wave of sound, gasps and murmurs rippling outward through the crowd, and Isadora, standing alone at the center of a circle that had just publicly and irrevocably answered the question she had risked everything to ask, closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them again, something in her posture had changed, the rigid defensiveness softening into something quieter and more resigned. She walked forward, alone, until she stood before Marin and the entire court held its breath, uncertain whether they were about to witness an act of grace or one final act of desperation. But Isadora only inclined her head, a small and formal bow, the kind given between equals rather than superiors and subjects. "I contested your claim because I feared what your existence meant for mine," she said, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. "The creatures have answered more honestly than I was willing to. I will not stand here and pretend grace I do not yet feel. But I will tell you plainly that I withdraw my challenge, and I will not raise another." She paused, and something almost like respect flickered across her expression. "Guard what has been given to you more carefully than I guarded what I only imagined I had earned." She turned and walked from the circle with her back straight and her steps even, refusing the crowd the satisfaction of watching her falter. And though her departure from court favor was swift in the weeks that followed, she left for her family's distant estate with her dignity, if nothing else, fully intact. A woman who had lost the game but not herself. Rydian crossed the circle to stand before Marin as the crowd began to stir, and he did not speak first to the court, to the historians, or to the advisors already murmuring about ceremonies and formal announcements. He spoke only to her. "You do not have to want the crown," he said. "The covenant recognized your blood, not your ambition, and I will not force a throne onto shoulders that never asked for one. But I am asking you, plainly and without any ceremony older than my own heart, whether you want to stay. Not as a healer summoned to court, not as an heir the old magic remembered, as the woman I have come to love more than I ever expected to love anyone." Marin looked at him, and behind them the white unicorn lifted its head and watched with those ancient, searching eyes as though it too awaited her answer. She thought of every year she had spent invisible, every noble who had never learned her name, every quiet moment she had convinced herself that being unseen was safer than being known, and she thought of a creature kneeling in the mud of a village square, choosing her, seeing her, when no one else in her life ever had. "I have spent my whole life being overlooked," she said, "and I promised myself I would never again reach for something I could not keep. But you did not ask me to reach first. You reached for me instead, and I find that I am no longer afraid of what happens if I let myself be held." The formal ceremony of recognition took place 1 month later, at the Blood Moon Festival, when the old magic was said to be strongest and the veil between the ordinary world and the ancient covenant thinnest. Marin stood beneath the same ancient oak, no longer in a plain healer's dress but in gown the color of dawn light. And when Rydian took her hand before the assembled court and the gathered village, and the 4 sacred creatures who had once again been called to bear witness, the white unicorn stepped forward and pressed its head gently against her shoulder, exactly as it had the very first day, a gesture the old historian wept openly to see, calling it the closing of a covenant 4 centuries in the making. The village of Aldermore never quite returned to the quiet obscurity it had known before the fair, though Marin made certain that the herb garden she had first tended in secret grew into something the whole kingdom eventually knew, a healer's row within the castle itself, where anyone, noble or common, could come and be seen and treated with the same careful attention she had once given in a market stall. No one important ever noticed. She never forgot what it felt like to be invisible, and she made certain, for the rest of her reign beside Rydian, that no one who came to her for help would ever feel that way again. If this story touched your heart even a little, please share it with someone who loves a slow and tender romance. And tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? Or did the unicorn surprise you as much as it surprised Marin herself?